Dahabeah by E.F. Benson. Published in the Cardiff Times and South Wales Weekly News on Saturday, May the 30th, 1896. Read by Bethina. I had been awake some time, wedged tight in my berth, with a knee against the wall and a foot against the iron rail, which prevented my falling bodily onto the floor, listening lazily to the drumming of the screw. We had passed through very rough weather the day before, and the boat was still rolling heavily. From time to time I could see the horizon, bearing Crete on its rim, swing into sight across the glass of the porthole, and now and then a great blue transparency of wave would fling itself against the window, darkening the cabin for a moment. Then the water, cast on the roof, scudded along again until another big wave took us in hand. But it was a glorious morning, and though I would willingly have prolonged those delicious moments which lie on the borderland between sleep and waking, I felt it my duty to wake Tom. He stretched himself lazily and sat up. "It is good to be at sea," he said. "When do we get to Alexandria?" "About 1. "Well, it's time to get up. Shall I get up first or you? How this old tub is rolling. There's not room for us both to dress together." "You," I said promptly. Tom rang the bell and ordered his bath. "Hot and salt," said he. He staggered into his dressing gown, plunged at his slippers, and sidled out of the cabin. I found to my disgust that I was too much awake to continue my thinking, and read the directions for putting on the lifebelt according to the principles of the P&O. Drowning, a horrible death. People who had been nearly drowned were supposed to say that it was delightful, like going slowly to sleep. Well, perhaps it was better than some deaths. And then, by a natural transition, my thoughts wandered to where I was going and what I was going to do. Tom and I were on our way to join Harry Brookfield. 6 months ago he had lost his wife. She had been dressing for a ball in London, and her dress caught fire. She died in a few hours. Since then he had been abroad, and this winter he was in Egypt. He had written to me saying that he was going up the Nile in a Dahabeah for a few months, and would Tom and I join him? And we, for our vices or virtues, being people of leisure, said we would. Harry had been in Cairo for a few days already, and we hoped to join him there in the evening. But the rough weather detained us, and we did not get into Alexandria till after the express for Cairo had left. Alexandria is not a particularly attractive place, but it has the smell of the south about it, and to me no place is without merit, providing it smells of the south. After dinner we sat in the open garden of the Hotel Abbot and smoked. Smoking begets silence, and silence thought, and thought speech. And after a little while Tom began to speak of a thing which had several times been in the background of my mind since the receipt of the letter which asked us to come to Egypt. "It's odd, Harry coming out to Egypt again, isn't it?" he said. "Why?" I asked, because I knew and did not wish to say. "His wife, you know. He spent his honeymoon on a Dahabeah up the Nile." "Yes, and on the same Dahabeah as that on which we are going now." "Have you seen him since it happened?" "Yes. I met him in Florence in November, and he came with me from there to Athens, before you came out." "How does he bear it?" "He never mentions her name, and tries never to think of her," I said. "That makes it all the odder he's taking this Dahabeah." "Yes, unless he has succeeded in never thinking of her." Harry met us the next day at Cairo station, and we were both, I think, surprised to see him looking so extremely well and prosperous. Great sorrow, and his sorrow had been very great, unusually leaves some trace behind, often some little nervous trick of manner, or more generally, when the mind is unoccupied, a haunted, anxious look. But he was in every respect his old cheery self. The traditional English plan of travelling in order to forget, which reverses the caelum non animus proverb, had evidently vindicated itself in his case. "Delighted to see you," he said. "Tom, you are growing fat. You shall sit in the sun till you are as dry as a grasshopper. As for you," he went on, turning to me, "you simply look absurdly well. People like you have got no business to spend a winter in Egypt. We'll go straight to the Dahabeah. She's ready, and we can start in an hour. Cairo is hateful, crammed full of the refuse of English-speaking people. One always sees on Shepherd's Verandah some 8 or 10 of the people one hoped never to meet again." And before 3 o'clock we were off. At this point in my story I must give a word of warning. I made no defence for what I am going to tell you, except the very unsatisfactory and unconvincing one that I declare that what I record as happening to me is true. Tom Soden is also willing to declare that what is recorded of him is true. Harry Brookfield died last year, and I can no longer make him a witness. But many people who, before his death, played whist with him, and Tom will tell you that they have often heard him say to Tom, "Why can't you play your hand as you played your dummies up the Nile?" And when he asked this question, Tom not unfrequently would turn rather pale and ask for a whisky and soda. That is all my defence. We started with a good north wind, which took us quickly along, the great sail stretched taut and firm, and the water rising from the forefoot in a thin feather. That evening we got to Memphis, and as the moon was full we took donkeys and rode out to Saqqara on the edge of the desert. There is an Arab proverb, "He who smells the desert once smells it when he dies," and sometimes in London, which smells quite different, I have felt on hot June evenings, when the air seemed to be dying with want of breath, that I should be almost willing to die if I could smell the desert once more. The truth is that the desert alone, of all things created, does not smell at all, and our sense of smell, the most delicate and keen sense we possess, finds it infinitely restful to draw in a warm, unused air that smells of nothing at all. Perhaps that is what the Arab proverb means. The moon was at its full. Jupiter, blazing low on the horizon, cast a shadow of its own. The 7 Pleiades, distinct and unblurred, hung high, freed of their silver net, and low in the north the Great Bear swung slowly to its setting, upside down. To the west the desert stretched away, silent and sombre, across a continent. Even Tom, who is not given to having feelings, felt its spell. "I should like," he said, "to walk straight into it forever. If only it was always moonlight." The fall storm was already beginning to glow faintly in the east when we got back to the Dahabeah, and a couple of hours after we had gone to bed we weighed anchor and, still followed by the north wind, slid on our course. For several days we led a delicious, uneventful life, reading not at all, talking not much, only sitting in the sun and charging our bodies with stores of superfluous health. But towards the end of the week Harry began to get rather restless, and it occurred by degrees to us all that we might perhaps do well to employ ourselves, however lazily, while we sat in the sun. The wind still held good, and it was a pity to stop the boat to go shooting, for the best shooting ground lay further up the river, and, in all human probability, we should have plenty of days on which we could not move, so that it was best to go on while we could. And one afternoon, while we were dozing after lunch, Tom said lazily, "Why not play cards?" Brookfield jumped up at once. "The very thing," he said. "Have any of you fellows got cards? We'll play whist with dummy. Whist is the only game one doesn't get tired of. 3 years ago we used to even play double—" and he stopped suddenly. Brookfield was amongst the best whist players in England, but as far as I can remember, his wife used to play even better than he. He, I know, always used to consider that she was the better player of the two. Personally, I play moderately well, but I have none of those instantaneous intuitions which mark a first-rate player's intuitions, which he will probably be able to justify by rule if he thinks, but which seem to dictate to him directly. Tom contrasted finely with Brookfield. He often had extraordinary promptings in his mind to play absolutely fatal cards, and his justification for following such promptings was a thing to make angels weep. That night after dinner, and for 25 successive nights, we played together, and sometimes also in the afternoon. On each occasion we cut for playing with dummy, and on each occasion, oddly enough, the cards determined that Tom should do so. We meant to write to the field about it, till more extraordinary events put it out of our minds. On the whole, this was the best arrangement, for Brookfield would not have cared for the game if he had played with Tom, and as it was a slight advantage to play with dummy, it was better that Tom should do so than he. We played small points, a shilling, I think, and we played the same all the time. For the first few nights, as was natural, Tom lost steadily but slowly, for the cards favoured him. He played his usual inconsequent game, if possible leading a singleton, starting a ruff at once, and after making a few tricks, having his trumps cleared out by a couple of rounds, and losing the majority of the remaining tricks. But on the fourth or the fifth night, he quite suddenly played a game correctly, or, to be accurate, he made his dummy play correctly. I had dealt, and his dummy was to lead. Dummy's hand contained 4 trumps, 6 spades, 2 diamonds and 1 heart, and Tom's horny fist was, as usual, stretched across the table to pick up the heart, but instead of playing it, he suddenly changed his mind and led a small trump, holding queen, 10 and 2 small ones. He himself took the first trick with the king and led them back. He hesitated a moment before playing dummy's card, but eventually played the 10, not the queen, and Brookfield took it with the ace. A round of diamonds fell to dummy, and he led the queen of trumps, capturing my knave. In other words, Tom, the illiterate, uneducated Tom, had executed a successful finesse. A simple one, it is true, but a correct and justifiable one. Dummy was now left with the 13th trump. He established his spades after 2 rounds, lost 1 trick in hearts, ruffed the next round with his remaining trump, and made 4 tricks in spades. Tom was already, then, up, and thus got out. Though Dummy's hand was a good one, Tom himself held no cards except the king of trumps, and the only way to get out was to play the hand exactly as Dummy had played it. Now, it was a simple enough hand to play for anyone who knew anything about whist, but you must remember that Tom knew nothing about whist. That he had generalised from watching our play was almost impossible, for he had invariably nailed his colours to the single 1 lead before that, and indeed the last time he had done so he had scored heavily, for both Harry and I had happened to be very weak in common suits, and had been unable to get the lead till the single ruff had developed into a double. Harry gathered up the cards and made them, while Tom dealt for dummy. "You played that hand correctly," he said. "Why didn't you lead Dummy's single card as usual?" "Well, you fellows always tell me it's wrong," he said, and it seemed hard luck on Dummy to make him play badly. "Ace of hearts," he added, turning up the trump card. Oddly enough, the next deal very closely resembled the last, but Tom held the sort of hand which Dummy had held before. He got the lead in the 3rd round and let his single club, spoilt his triumph by ruffing, let us in on clubs, and lost the odd. Harry gathered up the cards with a laugh. "So you've gone back to the old tactics," he said. "You had too many clubs, and besides, the trumps went badly for us," said Tom, meaning, I suppose, that he had only 1 club and had used his trumps to ruff. "The trumps lay just as they lay before when you scored offers by finessing," said Harry. "You could have done exactly the same thing again." "What's finessing?" asked Tom. Harry stared. "You finessed when you made the dummy play the 10 of trumps instead of the queen 2 rounds ago." "Did I?" said Tom. "It must have been a mistake. Don't argue, Harry. Whose deal?" There were 2 candles on the table where we were playing and a big lamp on the dining table. Once or twice Tom looked up quickly as if something had startled him, and then got up and moved the lamp away. All evening he seemed rather on edge, and when a moth flew in at the open window and immolated itself in the candle, he started to his feet, dropping his hand. He continued to play with his usual cheerful disregard of anything but the current trick. We played that night for about 2 hours, and though nothing interrupted the monotonous imbecility of Tom's play, I noticed several times that he played dummies cards rather well. But about 11 he said he was sleepy and yawned his way to bed, while Harry and I went on deck to smoke the last cigarette of the day. We had stopped for the night just below a small Arab village. A late-rising moon showed the mud huts huddled together on the bank, a few palm trees cutting the sky with their incisive fronds, and on either side the long line of the desert. It was very hot, and now and then a truffle of wind blew across the stream, a dry, scorching wind without health in it. A dog sat on the edge of the river, howling lugubriously. The moon was so bright that one could hardly resist the illusion that its light was hot, and indeed Harry moved his chair into the shade with a sudden impatient exclamation. Then there was silence again. After a while he spoke slowly and weighing his words. "It's very strange," he said to me, "but tonight I have felt again what I have not felt for nearly 6 months. You know, for a week after she died, I'm speaking of my wife, I used constantly to think that she was somewhere close to me. Now tonight, all through that game of whist, I felt it strongly. I suppose it is only the associations I have with this Dahabeah. Oddly enough, it's the same one that we came up in for our honeymoon. I tried to get another one instead, but I couldn't." He was silent a moment, and then went on. "You know I have always tried to avoid thinking of her," he said. "It is best to do so. It is no use keeping a wound open. Death is death, whatever you may say." He flicked the ash off his cigarette, which was nearly burned out, and lit another from the stump. "I have always tried to root these memories out of my mind," he went on, "and I mean to go on trying, but tonight that feeling was so strong, the feeling, I mean, that she was there, that I had to speak of it. It is a great relief to speak of things. If one bottles them up inside one, they go bad, so to speak. And now I have told you, and I feel better." He touched a bell, and the Arab servant came up. "Whisky and soda," said Brookfield. "Have one too, Vincent. 2 sodas." He shifted his chair again, as if showing that the subject was to be changed. "This moon is as big as a bandbox tonight," he said. "Don't you always imagine the moon to be as big as some small object? In England it varies between soup plates and half-crowns, but in the south it extends to bandboxes. It was almost a sin to sit in the cabin tonight, but the cards would have blown about here. By the way, did you notice Tom's play once or twice? He actually played intelligently." "Yes," said I, "but the funny thing was that he never played his own hand intelligently. It was always dummy that he managed well." "That's odd, I didn't notice it. Usually it's the other way round. Even a good player often rather spoils his dummy's hand for the sake of his own. At least a good player will often run a risk with his dummy's hand, which he wouldn't with his own. Do you know Bertie Carpuncle? He plays a cautious game himself, but if ever he plays with dummy, he makes his dummy do rash and brilliant things. It's the oddest thing to see." The whisky and soda arrived. We both silently blessed Mr. Schweppes, and were just preparing to turn in when Tom appeared in pyjamas. "Greedy boys," he remarked. "Give me some too. It's as hot as blazes below. My cabin had been shut up and it was stifling. By the way, which of you uses cherry blossom scent? My cabin smelt strongly of it." I saw Harry's eyes grow large and startled for a moment in the darkness, but he replied almost immediately, "Cherry blossom fiddlesticks. It's the bean fields. You can smell them here." Tom sniffed the hot night air. "I can't. Well, here's my whisky. 1 long drink and then I go to bed." We all went down again in a few moments, but as I passed Harry's cabin he called me in. You never use cherry blossom, do you? He asked. No, nor any other. I thought you said it was the Beanfields. Oh, of course it was. I forgot. Well, good night. Next evening brought us to our suite, and we spent an hour or two in the bazaars, which seemed to be full of cheap Manchester cottons. Tom thought them very native and characteristic, and bought several yards of a flimsy sort of calico stamped with the leaves of date palms in red. He was delighted with them till he found S number 2304 in the corner. We pointed out to him that they were just as pretty whether they had S number 2304 on them or not, but he was dissatisfied. That night, and on every night during the next week, we played whist after dinner. Each time, as I've said, Tom played with dummy, and his own play remained consistently bad, while his dummy play consistently improved. Often he would take up a bad card to lead, drop it again, and substitute a good one. It almost seemed as if one particular part of his brain played dummy, and another, his normal brain, played his own cards, or as if another will was superimposed on his when playing for dummy. Harry and I laughed at it and got accustomed to it, but Tom was always curiously unlike himself whilst he was playing. He was preoccupied and rather irritable. On one occasion, when it was dummy's lead, he sat looking at his cards so long that I was just going to remind him that he had to lead, when he suddenly looked up across the table to me and said, "Her lead, isn't it?" A moment afterwards, even before Harry had time to burst out laughing, he looked at us confusedly and said, "I beg your pardon, I don't know what I've been thinking about. Dummy to play, small heart." Harry put down his cards. "Our Thomas is asleep," he said, "and has been dreaming about her. What's her name, Tommy, and when's it going to come off?" But Tom had turned suddenly pale. "It's stifling in here," he said. "I wish to goodness one of you two wouldn't use cherry blossom. It's a vile scent. Besides, scents are not meant for men." "It's a she," said I. "Who is she, Tommy?" Once again Harry's eyes grew large and startled. "Come on," he said. "It's your turn, Vincent." That night, for the first time, I began to feel vaguely uncomfortable. I found myself looking towards Dummy's place quite seriously and quite instinctively. His very natural tone had led me to do it. Of course, I saw nothing there. The cards were arranged in suits on the table, and a chair, which happened to be put in such a position that if we had been playing four, Tom's partner would have been sitting in it, was of course empty. Then Harry's laugh broke in, and I wondered what I had looked up for. Once again Harry and I stopped up on deck for a few minutes, and he said to me, "Do you remember my telling you a few nights ago that I had determined not to think of her?" I made a great effort, and I have not failed. "Ah," he sniffed the air, "Beanfields again. That accounts for Tom's cherry blossom." That night I did not get to sleep for a long time. Every now and then I dozed a little, but was recalled to my senses by a sudden whiff of some faint smell passing by me. My cabin was separated from Tom's only by a curtain, and I thought I could hear him stirring. At length I got up, and he, too, as far as I could judge by faint rustling sounds that came from his cabin, was moving about, and I drew the curtain aside and looked in. The moonlight streamed in through the window, and by its light I could see that he was lying on his back, fast asleep. Of course there were 100 explanations. He was restless in his sleep, or it was the curtain over his door that had been rustling, for a strong wind was blowing up the passage that led from the saloon to the cabins, and I went back to bed again. Cherry blossom, cherry blossom. What a dim chord of memory twanged in my mind at the thought of it. Where had I smelt it? I could not remember what cherry blossom smelt like. Rather sickly, I should think. I dozed off again, thinking about it vaguely and dreamily, and suddenly woke with a start. That was the smell that I could perceive in my cabin now, the smell which Harry had said was Beanfields. And then, in a moment, I remembered where I had smelt it before. A crowded ballroom, a band playing a Strauss waltz, Harry's voice saying, "Hello!" I never expected to see you here. We are just back from Egypt. Come and see my wife." Then, finding myself on the balcony overlooking the square, where a tall, pale woman was sitting talking to half a dozen men. She saw me and smiled to me, putting out her hand, and I advanced to her. Then a little breeze shook the awning and wafted towards me the delicate scent, not sickly, of the smell I had perceived in my cabin when I awoke. Once again, that evening, when I was dancing with her, she dropped her handkerchief and I picked it up for her. Her handkerchief smelled of cherry blossom. I was frightened, and fright is tiring. After a few minutes, I fell asleep. The dragoman we had with us on the boat had taken the Brookfields up on their honeymoon, and next morning, as I was on deck, he came up to me and asked if we wanted to stop at Grigge. There was not anything to see there, he said, and when he had been up with Mr. and Mrs. Brookfield before, they had gone straight on. A sudden idea struck me, and I asked him which cabin Mrs. Brookfield had had. He thought for a moment and then said, "Number 3. I'm sure it was number 3, and Mr. Brookfield the one opposite." Number 3 was Tom's cabin. In the next few nights I can only remember one thing that struck me as curious, excepting, of course, the constant improvement in Tom's dummy play, and the slight deterioration, if anything, in his own. It was this. One night Dummy held a long hand of trumps, and it was Tom's lead. He opened with the king and ace of a common suit. Dummy only had 2, the 8 and the 4, and Tom played out the 8 first and then the 4. He then led another of the same sort for Dummy to ruff. Harry burst out laughing. "It is pathetic," he said. "You make Dummy call for trumps and then don't lead them to him. Poor ill-used Dummy." Tom looked puzzled. "I wanted him to trump," he said. "Then why did you make him call for trumps?" "Call for trumps? Oh, that's when you play a high one and then a low one, isn't it? He never called for trumps." But both Harry and I had noticed it. Though nothing else strange happened for 2 or 3 days, an odd change had begun to come over Tom. During the day he was himself, but after dinner he always became curiously nervous and agitated. One night, after I had gone to bed, he came into my cabin, half undressed, and sat for an hour there. He said his cabin was so close and stuffy, though it was the coolest cabin on the boat, and for the last day or 2 the heat had increased considerably. And while we were playing, whilst he would constantly glance up quickly and nervously, and more than once I saw him focus his eyes at the empty air in front of him, just in that same disconcerting way which dogs sometimes have towards dusk, as if they saw something which we could not see. Meanwhile we had gone steadily on. We had passed Grigge, and, if the wind held, we expected to be at Luxor, where we were to stop for a time before the end of the week. One night after dinner Tom and I were sitting on deck. The moon had not yet risen, but by the keen, clear starlight we could see the broad river stretched out in front of us like a plate of burnished metal. To the left rose high orange-coloured rocks, which gave out the heat they had been baked in during the day, and on the right lay the brown expanse of desert. An Arab below was chanting some monotonous native song, and the echo was returned from the rocks in a curious plaintive whine. Suddenly the wind dropped altogether, and the great sail flapped against the mast. The current took us slowly back, and as we neared the shore the anchor was thrown out, and we stopped for the night. Suddenly Tom caught my arm. "There, did you not see it?" he said. I looked quickly round in the direction of his finger, but there was only the pale glimmering deck, and behind the circle of the sky. "It came last night to fetch us to play whist," he said. "I am frightened. Oh, I am frightened. Let us go quicker, it will come again." "My dear Tom, what do you mean?" I asked. "Never mind, it is nothing," he said. "Come quickly, it will be all right then." And he literally dragged me downstairs. "Harry, where are you?" he called. "Come and play whist, it's getting late." "Well, I've been waiting for you," shouted a voice from the saloon. Again we cut for dummy, and again it fell to Tom. For the last week he had won steadily. That night, whether it was that Tom's strange terror had affected my nerves, I do not know, for though I had at present neither seen nor heard anything peculiar, from the moment I began to play I felt that there was something living in the room beside ourselves, and when on one occasion I looked round and found the soft-footed dragoman who had entered the room to get orders for next day without my hearing him, standing at my elbow, I could have shrieked aloud. It must have been about 9 when we began. Harry, as usual, was absolutely absorbed in the game, but Tom's eyes went peering nervously about the cabin, and, as for me, I confess to having been absolutely upset. But the game went on quietly, and by degrees I recovered myself. Tom was playing even worse than usual, and the dummy had not much opportunity to distinguish himself. But at length there came a hand, I cannot remember all the details of it, in which, towards the end, dummy held 3 suits, his trumps being exhausted, in 2 of which, diamonds and spades, Harry and I were both over him. Tom had already run out of spades and held only 1 small diamond. He led the ace of hearts, in which suit dummy held the king and knave. Tom took up the knave and put on 3rd hand, hesitated, and played the king instead. He then led the queen, which drew the knave, and after that the 10. He was 4 up already, and this secured him the odd trick. Then said Tom, "What a fool I was to play the king! I can't think why I did it." Harry gasped. "Why, man, if you'd played any other card, you'd have lost the odd, don't you see? If dummy had not played the king, the lead would have been placed in his hand next round, and he would have had to play a diamond with a spade. You had to unblock." Tom said frankly that he did not understand, and the game went on. The next round dummy played the grand coup, the opportunity for which seldom occurs, and it is seldom recognised, but Tom saw it at once. 2 rounds afterwards I had just picked up my cards and was sorting them when, it takes longer to describe this than it did to take place, I was suddenly conscious of something seen out of the corner of my eye on my left. Also, I could no longer see the white flush of cards where dummy's hand was laid on the table. I saw a glimmer as of a white dress, a faintly outlined profile, and at that moment a little breeze blowing in through the open window wafted across me a faint smell of cherry blossom. The whole thing was instantaneous, and I looked up from the hand I was sorting. There was nothing there. Dummy's cards were laid on the table, the chair was empty, and the little puff of wind had passed. Then, looking at Tom, I saw that he was looking fixedly at the opposite side of the table. Moist beads of perspiration stood on his forehead, and one hand was clutching the tablecloth. Then he gave a long-drawn breath of horror, and his head fell forwards on the table. We raised him and soon brought him round. He had complained all day of headache, and he said he thought he had had a touch of the sun. He was sorry to break up the game, but he thought he had better go to bed. No doubt he would be all right in the morning, and would Harry mind his moving into the other empty cabin? Next morning he seemed better, but nervously anxious not to be left alone. Harry spent the morning in writing letters, and Tom and I sat on the deck. I expected he would speak of something, I did not know what, and before long he did. There had been a silence, and Tom broke it. "Did you see nothing?" he said. It would have been a mere affectation to pretend not to know what he meant. "I hardly know if I did or not," I said. "But her face," he went on almost in a whisper. "There was a horrible scar across it, a bar of raw burned flesh. What happened then? I fainted, did I not?" "Something rather like it." "It is only in the evening she's here," he said, "only when we are playing whist or when she wants to play. She will come for us to play tonight again, as she did last night." He threw himself back in his chair despairingly. "I can't tell Harry about it," he said. "Besides, I don't think he knows she's there. She does not come to him, but only to play whist. It is horrible. Even if I don't see her, I know she is there. Wait a minute." He got up out of his chair and ran downstairs. 5 minutes later he returned. "Stand up," he said, "and look at the water behind us." I looked closely at the broken wake of the boat. 30 yards behind us the water was covered with a quantity of little white specks. "What? Have you thrown the cards overboard?" I asked. "Yes, it is worth trying." That evening, for the first time for 26 nights, we did not play whist. The boat was ransacked for the cards, but they had vanished. Harry was furious, but we never told him what we had done. And with the cards vanished the thing which had taken Dummy's place. That was Dummy on a Dahabeah, one of E.F. Benson's less well-known ghost stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to click the like button before you leave. There are more ghost stories on my channel. Check the audiobooks playlist. And as always, thank you for listening.